Okay, now what I want to do is talk about A.C. Ewing, or author C. Ewing's essay, A Critique of Utilitarianism. Now, what I need to say is that almost all this essay is criticizing classical utilitarianism. Okay, but at the end of the essay, Ewing talks about the valuable role that utilitarianism could play as one of the major standards for determining public policy. That is to say, helping us create and evaluate laws, regulations, and forms of government. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But in any event, I will say that most of this essay is a criticism of utilitarianism, and especially classical utilitarianism, about which I spoke in the previous lecture. Okay, so what Ewing is doing in his essay is, first, he's defining utilitarianism, and what he's really doing, though, is talking about classical utilitarianism, but he's not calling it that. But in any event, he just says, I'm going to evaluate utilitarianism, but first I want to discuss what it is. First I need to discuss what it is. And then he says, it seems to be pretty much the same thing as what philosophers have called universalistic hedonism. Now, that's what he says. Now, universalistic because it considers everybody's good. Hedonism because it holds pleasure to be the only good. It maintains that our sole duty is to produce as much pleasure as possible, counting for this purpose a diminution of pain as equivalent to an increase in pleasure, and holds that in doing so we should count every man's pleasure as of equal worth to that of any other man. Okay, now, so universalistic hedonism, saying that pleasure is the sole good, it's the ultimate good, and then saying that we need to maximize it. Okay, and basically that's the same sort of thing as classical utilitarianism. Okay, so what's going on is you'll find out that just about everything he's saying, almost everything he's saying in his essay, almost everything he's saying is a criticism of either the thesis that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, or it's a criticism of the thesis that we should always maximize pleasure, and that, in other words, that maximizing pleasure will always produce the morally right action. Almost everything in his, at least until the end, until near the end, when he's talking about the usefulness of utilitarianism as a major guide to creating and evaluating public policy, laws, and forms of government. Okay, so when he's criticizing utilitarianism, he's criticizing it as a theory for ordinary people in everyday situations. Okay, and what he says near the beginning of his essay is that in certain respects, this position of utilitarianism is stricter. In other respects, it's less strict than what he calls common sense morality. But he doesn't, he says, as compared to common sense morality, a consistent utilitarianism would be in some respects stricter, in other sense less strict. Ordinarily, we consider that we are much more under an obligation to some people than to others. We admit indeed that we are under some obligation to help anyone in need. But at the same, then he goes on and says, but we feel a much stronger obligation to promote the happiness of our own family, as is shown by the general attitude to appeals for charity. Right? You've heard this saying, charity begins at home. it is clear that the money spent by a man in order to provide his son with a university education could save the lives of many people who were perishing of hunger and of famine, yet most people would rather blame than praise a man who should deprive his son of a university education on this account. Okay, by the way, I think even a better example to give to illustrate his point would be that he doesn't give this example, but I think it would be even a better example. Think of a father who is on the shore of some beach, and he has a son, and the son to his left is in the water and is unfortunately drowning. But then to his right, maybe each of the, maybe they're 10, 15 yards away, to his right, there are two kids who are also drowning. And let's suppose that if he were to save the two kids, he'd be producing more pleasure than if he saved his son. Right? Well, Ewing would say that we ordinarily believe, meaning most people, believe that, in fact, that father would have a special moral duty to save his son, even if that meant not saving the two strangers. In other words, we could either save the two strangers or his son, that he should save his son, even if saving the two strangers would produce more pleasure in the world. I think that would be a good example of the sort of thing that he has in mind. So it looks as if on some level, he likes common sense morality, but he never really defines it. But he says that common sense morality, says, is different from utilitarianism. And then, okay, so his position is utilitarianism is going to differ from common sense morality. And he thinks that it seems as if he's more approving of common sense morality than utilitarianism, at least for ordinary people in everyday circumstances. Okay? And then he gives other examples. He was saying that, well, if some man reduced the standard of living of his family to just barely above poverty, because if he could give away more and more to others who would be more in need of his wealth, his income, let's say, then he said we wouldn't think that's automatically the right thing to do. Yet if we were utilitarians, and he says we would think that that's what we would say that he should do. And then he goes on and he says, as a matter of fact, would we approve of some poor man cheating a wealthier person, maybe a much wealthier person? Would we approve of that? And even if it's true that if by cheating that wealthier person, the poor man made the world a happier place than if the poor man did not cheat the wealthy person. And what he says is, I don't think we'd approve of that. I think that we believe, here's what he has to say. A poor man who's prepared to cheat a richer may say it would be a bad thing if everybody acted like me, but why should not I do so when it is certain that my action will not result in everybody acting like me? It seems only possible to answer such a question adequately if I say that it is unfair to profit by the rules governing society and yet refuse yourself to obey them. But if we appeal to fairness, we are introducing another consideration besides happiness. It may therefore be doubted whether we can give an adequate account of our obligations without abandoning utilitarianism and admitting that there are other obligations which we should not ignore even in order to produce greater happiness, and that it is bad to acquire happiness by unfair means, whether for ourselves or others. It is indeed difficult to maintain that it cannot under any circumstances be right to lie. Now, etc. on utilitarian grounds, for example, to save life. But it seems to me pretty clear that utilitarian principles logically carried out would result in far more cheating, lying, and unfair action than any good man would tolerate. This is not, of course, the same thing as saying that utilitarians are more likely to cheat and lie than other people, but only that if they carried out their theory consistently, they would be so. Okay, and then he goes, by the way, the theory of utilitarianism isn't as simple as some people may think. He goes, how are we going to measure each he talks, he goes, we may add that utilitarianism is far from being so simple a theory to apply as has been claimed by its advocates. How are we going to measure against each other quite different kinds of pleasure and say how many times more pleasure seeing Hamlet will give a particular man than will a good dinner? And it becomes still more complicated when we can introduce different agents who cannot be expected all to take the same amount of enjoyment and the same pleasures. Yet such calculations are necessary if we're to apply the utilitarian criterion consistently to all practical questions. Similar difficulties will no doubt arise with any ethical theory that takes account of consequences, as surely we must. But at least this shows that utilitarianism has less cause than might be thought to pride itself on simplicity. It's about as difficult to estimate the relative pleasantness of different pleasures as it would be on a non-hedonistic view to estimate their relative goodness. Okay. Now, by the way, things are even a bit more complicated than Ewing is suggesting, because even the same person can value the same activity or pleasure differently over time. There are times when I don't want my favorite meal, as when I've just had my favorite meal, or when I desperately need sleep. So even sometimes we want certain pleasures, and other times we don't want that same pleasure. So we don't value the same activity or pleasure equally in all circumstances. And things get even more complicated when you talk about actions that affect all sorts of people at the same time. In any event, and he goes on and he talks about if you believe that the only thing good in itself is pleasure, he goes, how are you going to handle the different sorts of pleasures that people have? He says, and he gives us an example. He's quoting from another philosopher, but we don't need to worry about this. He goes, a man who is watching a Shakespearean tragedy with full understanding and aesthetic appreciation at its highest pitch may be enjoying no more pleasure quantitatively than a drunkard who is amusing himself by smashing crockery. So somebody's smashing a bunch of dishes. Yet it is surely obvious that the former's pleasure is worth more than the latter's. Okay, but again, how are we going to measure all this stuff? Okay, to say that pleasure is the only good and yet admit that a lesser pleasure may be preferable to a greater is like saying that money is the only thing which counts and then adding that money earned by public work is better than the same amount of money earned by business. If pleasure is the only good, the more pleasure, always the better. Now, this is interesting, okay? You know what's interesting? He's actually, in a way, at least on this one issue, agreeing with Bentham. Because I had said in the earlier lecture, I said that according to Bentham, if you're going to believe that pleasure is the only thing good in itself, then the more pleasure the better, and you have no business saying that some pleasures are superior to others, even though they're not of greater quantity. Because there's a sense in which if you say pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself, and then you prefer one pleasure to another because of its essential or inherent nature, it's as if you're introducing another standard of value in addition to pleasure. But you've just said that pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself. So what's the moral here? The moral here is that Ewing believes that if you're a classical utilitarian and you're arguing and asserting that pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself, then you cannot justifiably say that some pleasures are intrinsically better than others, they're better qualitatively than others. So in other words, what he's saying in effect is, if you're a classical utilitarian, you ought to think like Bentham, although he thinks it's an inadequate view, because for one thing, he thinks it's an adequate view, classical utilitarianism, because for one thing, he doesn't think pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself. And second, he doesn't think that the morally right action will always be that which maximizes the net pleasure, the amount of pleasure create minus any pain. But in any event, so what he's saying is, he's saying people have no business, if they're classical utilitarians and saying pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself, preferring one pleasure to another unless it is for reasons of quantity. So that would mean that he is, he's opposed, of course, to classical utilitarianism, but he's also opposed to anyone who claims to be defending classical utilitarianism, and who says that some pleasures are intrinsically better than others. In other words, better than others apart from quantity. And by the way, that is the position of E. Daniel Kay, right? E. Daniel Kay is saying, I disagree with Bentham. I believe that some pleasures are preferable to others independently of quantity. That is the position of John Stuart Mill, who was also a classical utilitarian, but it's certainly not the position of Bentham. And Ewing is saying, although he disagrees with classical utilitarianism, in effect what he's saying is that Bentham was right to say that pleasures can differ only in quantity, given Bentham's belief that pleasure is the only thing good in itself, that he was right, and in effect John Stuart Mill was wrong, and presumably he would say that E. Daniel Kay is also wrong for thinking that you can be a classical utilitarian and still believe that some pleasures are qualitatively better than others. And then he goes on and he says something interesting. He says, in order to decide whether one pleasure can be qualitatively better than another, let us consider the following instances. Let us suppose that you are offered 50 more years, each equal in quantity of pleasure to the most pleasant year you have ever spent, but that the pleasure was to be derived entirely from eating, drinking, playing childish games, and lying in the sun. Imagine this proposed life shorn of every element of intelligence above that of an imbecile, of all aesthetic experience, in other words, all experience of art and of beauty, of all love of other men. Now suppose that you are offered as an alternative 49 years of equal pleasure, but that in this case the pleasure was no longer to be derived exclusively from these sources, but also from the exercise of intelligence, of love, and of developed capacity to appreciate the best in art and literature. Okay, and so he's saying that wouldn't we in general say that the life that has not only the pleasures of children, but includes also pleasures from the development of an exercise of intelligence, of love, and a capacity to appreciate the best in art and literature, wouldn't we say that that latter life, even if it had somewhat less pleasure in it, it didn't have quite the same amount of pleasure, but it still had a lot of pleasure, wouldn't we say in general that life was preferable to the life of more pleasure, but all the pleasures are those that could be fully enjoyed by ordinary children? So what he's saying is we value certain experiences because of the sorts of experiences they are, and not simply in direct proportion to how much pleasure they produce. Okay, and he actually gets into this further, and I know this can get complicated, but he says this further, and he says, in the first place, we must admit that not only the quantity but the quality of pleasure is relevant, so that a lesser pleasure of a higher kind may rightly be preferred to a greater pleasure of a kind which is lower. But what makes one pleasure higher than another? Now, what he says is the following. It is not a difference in the nature of the pleasurable feeling as such. It is rather a difference in the activity of the mind with which it is connected, or in its object. Some pleasures are regarded as higher than others because they are connected with thinking, aesthetic experiences, love, moral action. We regard these activities as higher than eating and drinking and having an intrinsic value which must be added to any intrinsic value possessed by the pleasures they give us pleasure. Okay. Now, if we classify pleasures and activities according to their object, we value especially those concerned with the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. Okay, so what he's saying is there are certain experiences and activities that we highly value, but not in direct proportion to how much pleasure they produce. We value them because of the sorts of activities they are. And so therefore, he's saying it is simply false to say that the value of any activity is to be directly proportional to the amount of pleasure it produces. Okay? So he, again, remember what I said. Almost everything in his essay is a criticism of either the proposition that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, the only thing good in and of itself, and or the criticism of the proposition that we should always maximize the net pleasure, the amount of pleasure create minus any pain. Okay, so he's saying that no, there are other things that we value, but not in direct proportion to the amount of pleasure they create. We value self-improvement. We value the exercise and development of virtues. We value love. We value the creation and appreciation of art. We value friendship. We value all relationships, but we value all sorts of things, but not only in direct proportion to the amount of pleasure these things create. Okay, so again, almost everything he's saying in this essay is a criticism of one of those two defining propositions, the propositions defining classical utilitarianism. Now, there are some other things that I want to bring to your attention, and that is near the end of his essay, he says that even though he spent a lot of time criticizing utilitarianism, he has been criticizing it as a guide to action for ordinary people in everyday circumstances. But he's saying, even though he doesn't want the average person in everyday circumstances to think completely like utilitarian. Now, why? Well, because for one thing, a father may neglect the welfare of his own children if he thinks, well, no, if I pay more attention and give more money to some strangers, I can produce more pleasure, and he doesn't think that would be right. Okay? Or a poor person might think he or she is automatically justified in cheating a wealthier, and he doesn't think that's right. And so what he says is that the moral life is much more complex than classical utilitarianism suggests, because there are all sorts of morally important factors that can determine what is right or wrong. Sometimes what will be morally right is that which is fulfillment of someone's role responsibilities, as when a father is saving his son who's drowning as opposed to two other children who are strangers, when he cannot save, unfortunately, all three at the same time. But in any event, what I want you to understand is that near the end of the essay, Ewing says that utilitarianism, though, has a lot to offer as one of the main standards that people should use in creating laws, public regulations, and creating and evaluating forms of government. Now, and this is interesting. Now, you need to understand that when utilitarianism became increasingly popular in the 17 and 1800s, that it was especially put forward as a basis for changing the laws in England. You know, what's interesting is Jeremy Bentham was in certain ways ahead of his time, I suppose, because Jeremy Bentham thought that various sexual acts were, condemned by the law between consenting adults, and Bentham said, well, that shouldn't be. If they're consenting adults, we shouldn't have laws against that. That reflects somebody's personal and private morality, but you should not use the law. The law is a blunt instrument. It can cause a lot of suffering, and so you should not throw people in prison for consensual acts, especially, if we're talking about adults. Everyone's an adult here. Well, in any event, so Bentham held that we should have all sorts of changes in the law, and he was speaking especially about the criminal law in England during his day. And it turned out that many followers of Bentham, after Bentham died, did make various changes in the criminal law in England, and they were inspired by Bentham. So notice what he says near the end of his essay. Ewing says, "It is of interest that utilitarianism made its mark, especially in the field of political and large-scale social reform. In these matters, I think utilitarianism comes very much nearer to providing a completely satisfactory criterion than in the sphere of individual ethics. For here we're concerned rather with the removal of causes of unhappiness than with the direct promotion of positive good. You cannot produce high morality or fine art or science by law or make people love each other. and you had much better not try. But you can ameliorate, in other words, improve their physical state and remove many causes of avoidable suffering. We must not regard it as an argument for utilitarianism that, if it were universally adopted and consistently carried out by everybody, we would be secure from war and soon end acute poverty throughout the world. For the same would be true of any and all plausible ethical theory, of which there are a great variety. But I wish for more straightforward utilitarian argument in politics, not less. I should like to emphasize this point strongly, because whatever is the ultimate truth about utilitarianism, it is plain at least that we have no right to increase greatly human unhappiness or subtract greatly from human happiness unless this grave disadvantage be outweighed by a very important gain in respect of other goods, or could be avoided by action that for some other reason was immoral. And then he goes on and says that I'm convinced that a critical survey of either communism, fascism, Nazism, or laissez-faire individualism, he's talking about completely unregulated economics, would show that they have made enormous sacrifices of human happiness which were not necessary to further any good that could rationally be approved by a sane man, or to avoid action that could be called immoral. Hence, they must be condemned even apart from the fact that they are of the greatest detriment also to goods other than happiness. Okay, so what he's saying is that if it's true, as I think a lot of people would concede, let's say, that Nazism created a lot more suffering, even for the Nazis, than happiness, right? Because eventually, not only did Hitler plunged the world into a world war, but Germany was literally reduced to rubble, and there were millions of people killed, and in the war, and also millions of peaceful citizens were intentionally killed on Hitler's orders. But in any event, so what he's saying is the fact that some policy or some form of government will produce a lot more unhappiness than happiness is normally a very strong reason for condemning those things. Okay? So he thinks that when it comes to public policies, laws, or forms of government, and now remember, all these things can influence the happiness and well-being of literally millions of people. He says when it comes to these things, we should use utilitarian calculations or estimates as one of the main standards we have. And so what he's saying is utilitarian calculations are very important, and they should be used, especially, again, when dealing with what kind of laws we should have, what sort of regulations we have, and what sorts of government we have. Okay, so again, most of his essay is a criticism of classical utilitarianism, but it's speaking of that as a theory for ordinary people in everyday circumstances. But if you're talking about what politicians should do, public regulators should do, he thinks these sorts of people who are to come up with policies and regulations and governments, all of which can affect literally millions of people and the welfare and the happiness of millions of people. He thinks when you're dealing in that public arena, utilitarianism should be one of your main standards. So in any event, this is pretty much what I wanted you to understand. We need to understand how most of the essay is critical of classical utilitarianism. And at the same time, at the end of the essay, he is praising utilitarianism as one of the major guides for, again, public regulations, laws, and forms of government. In other words, we should use it as a guide to determine what sort of laws will be most likely to reduce suffering, what sorts of policies will be most likely to reduce suffering, what sorts of governments will be most likely to reduce suffering. So if Nazism or some other form of totalitarianism has shown in the past to produce much more pain than happiness, then we have generally a good reason for condemning these things. And that's pretty much what I wanted you to know about the essay, A Critique of Utilitarianism by A.C. Ewing.